What was a fact taught to you in school that has now been disproven? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Vancher channel. Also, please share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let's get started. Story 1. Tongues having different areas for taste. Edit, I've lost count of the replies from people just learning this. Story 2. Giant squids aren't real. I wrote a report on them in middle school, and my teacher made me rewrite it because she said I could only cover something that existed. Needless to say, my distrust for authority started young, and every time I see a news report on one, I think of her. Answer. I went to an SDA, Seventh-day Adventist school for a few years. I got my first F when I turned in my book report. The assignment was to do a report on any book you wanted. I put a lot of work into it. The shoot was awesome, and I was proud to turn it in. The book was The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Reason for the F? Magic. Rather than to do the report over, I took the F and went to summer school and had a blast. Years later, I realized that the series is an allegory for Christianity. Fudge Mrs. Gray. Story 3. The food pyramid was a bunch of nonsense created by lobbyists, and the government just went, sure, let's educate all our children based on that when it comes to nutrition. Answer. The food pyramid was made by the USDA, which, surprise, surprise, had the purpose of promoting American agriculture. Health, nutrition, etc. are through DHHS. So naturally, the Department of Agriculture wanted to promote a grain carb-based diet as American farmers grow those crops. They also wanted to demonize fats, as fat-free versions of foodstuffs tend to have even more carbohydrates. In reality, the best diet is based on fruits, legumes, and vegetables. Grains, dairy, and meat definitely have their place in a well-balanced diet. Processed foods are the real demons. Story 4. In a social studies unit in 3rd grade, we learned the different family types: nuclear, extended, etc. Ms. Abraham asked the class if anyone lived in an extended family household, and I raised my hand because my great-grandmother, uncle, and cousins lived in our house. She then told me I was wrong because Americans don't live in extended families. Fudge Ms. Abraham for many reasons, but especially that bit of passive prejudice. Answer. Mine was Mrs. Roberts. And what happened was, we were reading this novel about pandas, and in the novel it had the Chinese name for panda. I had read the book the year previously and learned how to pronounce the word correctly. Well, Fudge Mrs. Roberts thought you pronounce things like you do in English, mainly by how it's spelt, like full-on racial discrimination and disrespect to the language. Xingmo was the name. She kept saying, no, it's oxing mayo. I kept arguing with her to the point I got lunch detention for a week. Fudge you, Mrs. Roberts. Story 5. A common one that even my dad, who's a geophysicist, believed was that glass slowly flows, and that's why old windows are thicker at the bottom. Truth is, glass does not flow at room temperature but to high viscosity liquid. Although glass shares some molecular properties with liquids, it is a solid at room temperature and only begins to flow at hundreds of degrees above room temperature. Old glass, which is thicker at the bottom than at the top, comes from the production process, not from slow flow. No such distortion is observed in other glass objects of similar or even greater age. Answer. Geophysicists have to consider long-term creep of solids, so it's natural for them to not rule out viscous flow of any material in theory. Lead pipes sag visibly from creep even over a time period as short as decades, for example. However, soda-lime glass is well-bonded and refractory, so its homologous temperature at room temperature is much lower than that of lead, and creep rates scale roughly exponentially with the homologous temperature. And its microstructure doesn't allow easy slip in the manner of ductile metals. So in practice, we won't see creep in windows or glass artifacts, as you note, and it's unfortunate that manufacturing variations have gotten mixed up into discussions of creep and solid-liquid dichotomy. Story 6. We were taught the story of Rosa Parks. In our version, she was a simple woman who worked in a department store. After a long day of work, she sat in the white-only section of a bus because there were no seats in the colored section. When told to move, she decided that she was too tired and refused. She was arrested, and that led to the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the most famous events in the civil rights movement. It was years later I learned that she was a civil rights activist with a long history of protesting. She made a conscious decision to sit in the white-only section, knowing she would be arrested. It does not make her actions any less heroic. Story 7. The food pyramid is a healthy nutritional model. 30 years later, and I still occasionally catch myself analyzing my meal choices against the food pyramid. Story 8. Men have less ribs than women. I went to a private Christian school. Editing to clarify, I just considered it fact for myself because when you grow up never hearing anything different, you never even think to doubt it. I was an embarrassing 23 years old before I ever heard anyone say anything to the contrary. I literally remember where I was, what I was wearing, who said it. It completely baffled me at the time. Story 9. Brontosaurus. I guess it wasn't its own dinosaur, but some other existing sauropod. But the Cleveland Natural History Museum had a Brontosaurus skeleton on display for years before changing it a few years ago. But now I'm thinking I read something recently that said it was a different type of sauropod. Story 10. Astronomer here. One thing that's truly revolutionized since I was a kid is back in the day we thought planets were really rare. Like sure, we had 9 in our solar system, Pluto repeat, but that was probably a quirk because planetary formation must be super rare. That has, of course, revolutionized in recent decades, with over 6,000 confirmed extrasolar planets around other stars and counting. In fact, we now think planets are so common in the universe that statistically all stars have planets. Like there obviously aren't around 100 of stars, but enough stars have multiple planets that it averages out. Amazing what a difference this is in just a few years. By the way, the reason scientists insisted planets are rare is there's a step in planetary formation they couldn't figure out. Think how do we go from small clumps of material to meter-sized clumps? And the thing is, we actually still can't explain it. We just got better at finding them, so we now see planets everywhere we look. Answer. Probably a quirk because planetary formation must be super rare. This surprises me. My primary secondary schooling was in the 60s and 70s, and all I can recall is being told we can't see planets outside the solar system, but we can presume they are common based on the cosmological principle. It seems antithetical to the scientific method to presume rarity based on a lack of evidence, when that lack of evidence is due to the weakness of our tools. Story 11. T-Rex had huge teeth showing all the time. Recently, this has been shown to be false. T-Rex had lips like any other lizard or dinosaur. My whole life has been a lie ever since my first little plastic dinosaur toy in cartoons. Story 12. When it comes to history, a lot of the history you learn can be greatly watered down or just outright wrong. To be somewhat fair, history changes over time. It sounds weird to say, but what happened and what actually happened are rarely the same. As new evidence is found or documents become unclassified, what changes. As far as a simple example of just being wrong in the U.S. is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. First, Revere was not the only rider. There were 3 riders originally, and many more joined in to spread the message. Second, he never said the British are coming. At the time, everyone was still British, so the message would have been confusing at best. What he actually said was something like the regulars are coming. Lastly, Revere did not complete the ride. He only rode around 13 of the way before being captured by British soldiers. Of the 3 prongs riders, only Samuel Prescott escaped and completed the ride. Answer: TBF, it's not really accurate to say that it's wrong. For one thing, growing up in New England, I always heard it as the redcoats are coming, and everyone knew that the message spread across the countryside, implying many riders and messengers. That was the whole point. Plus, it really was Paul Revere's plan. He organized it and carried the initial message that set off the network. Story 13. That humans have only 5 senses. We were taught sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, but science now recognizes many more, like proprioception, knowing where your body is in space, balance, vestibular sense, temperature, pain, and time perception. Story 14. DRE told me people would give me free substances to get me hooked. I'm still waiting 35 years later. Story 15. Premature birth is a birth defect. I took a child development class in high school, and the teacher assigned everyone an essay. Mine was birth defects. We were told to use our books for information. I wrote in my essay that the book was wrong. Premature birth, in and of itself, is not a defect. She gave me a bad grade and a red ink diatribe about how the book is right, and I need to accept that. About 4 years later on CNN, a doctor was talking about how premature birth isn't a defect. I thought about being petty and demanding that my grade be changed, but I'd already graduated and it was kind of pointless. Answer: wait, that used to be a thing? Logic just tells me that premature birth is obviously not a birth defect in the same way a cleft palate is, for example, even if it is a birthing defect like preeclampsia or breech birth or something, because it's not a permanent developmental defect. Defects in the birthing process, like premature delivery, aren't the same as defects in development, a birth defect. Weird. Story 16. That my ability to be employed and how much money I could make would be directly correlated with many words per minute I could type. The amount of time we spent in school sitting at giant electronic typewriters would be hard to calculate. Endless typing tests. Teachers made it sound like unless I could type at least 60 WPM, I would be homeless and destitute. Guess how many employers have tested my typing speed in my entire life? Answer. On the other hand, I'm a technical writer because I could pass a typing test. Out of college, I gave up the career I had planned on because it wasn't going to work out for me. I was going to be a high school teacher, but I was terrible at teaching high school kids, and I had no idea what to do. I ended up temping in offices because I could type fast and wasn't scared of computers. This was back when you need decent money to own a computer of any sort, but I worked in the college computer labs, and the temping led to a short position as a technical writer for a government agency who just needed to get a document out without paying a real writer. That led me to real technical writing jobs and an eventual solid career. I'm eternally grateful to Mrs. Ortiz in 11th grade for getting me over 100 WPM. Story 17. I studied psych at university, and it was the era of behaviorism where they believed all behavior was learned and there were no genetic predispositions. Answer. I remember in 1990-89 counseling classes learning that soon we would find the gene behind various mental illnesses and be able to treat that. Took an updated class 5 years ago and learned that just ADHD has over 800 possible spots on genes that can influence it and how it presents in an individual, depending on the particular manifestation on that person, that have been found so far, and we are just starting to scratch the surface. And that is not even considering epigenetics, environment, cultural understanding, etc., etc. Story 18. That humans only use 10% of their brains sounded official in school, but science later completely debunked it hard. Story 19. In my public school, we were taught that Hebrew slaves built the pyramids. Not only have we found that the pyramids were not built by slaves, but if Hebrews were in Egypt, they were there centuries after the pyramids were built. I was also taught that I wouldn't just have a calculator on me at all times. Answer. The calculator one was always a lie anyway. The actual answer to why not just use a calculator is that this is a useful skill that you need to actually understand. Not sure if the standard answer is that it was a lot easier to explain to children, or because primary school teachers aren't typically from STEM backgrounds, and they weren't really sure. Story 20. Learning I before E except after C in English, then going to science class was particularly frustrating. But I don't know if that counts as it being disproven if it was just always wrong. Story 21. That Neanderthals did not breed with modern humans. They died out. This was in college, sweet Lord. I always strongly believed they did mix. Story 22. I was in middle school back in the 80s. My family bought a fresh set of encyclopedias. We were learning about matter and phases. When the teacher asked how many there were, I raised my hand and said 4. Everyone chuckled because the science book said 3. I explained solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Even told him what it was as I had read up on it. He said I was wrong and we were learning the book, which was 15 years old. I told him the book was wrong and there were 4. The fudge gave me detention. I have never forgotten Mr. Foster. Story 23. My 7th grade biology teacher taught us that blood is blue inside the human body. Human blood is always red inside your body. It's never blue, but it appears blue through your skin due to an optical illusion, as oxygen-rich blood is bright red and oxygen-poor. Venous blood is dark, purplish red. The blue look comes from how light penetrates skin, scattering blue light back while red light is absorbed, making veins seem blue even though the blood within is always red. Story 24. When I was a little kid, there was Brontosaurus. Then they said it was actually Apatosaurus. About 10 years ago, Brontosaurus came back. Story 25. I went to a parochial school in the early 70s. A nun told our class, the United States won the Vietnam War. I objected by asking about all the people frantically leaving on helicopters on the TV news. I was told, that's just a play you were watching. I have been told nuns do not regularly teach in Catholic schools anymore, but I have my doubts. The nuns also frequently mixed up there, and there, even in spelling tests. You were a bad child for pointing to the nun. Story 26. Michelangelo used muted colors for the Sistine Chapel so the figures would look like they were made of stone, like sculptures. The ceiling was actually covered in soot, with pastel colors revealed by cleaning. Story 27. That Columbus was some hero visionary who discovered the U.S. because he was the only one who believed the world was round. Multiple levels of wrong, and for some reason we still have Columbus Day. Answer, my understanding is that Columbus was more wrong about the size and shape of the Earth than his contemporaries. He assumed a much smaller model of the Earth, which would have made it feasible to sail west to India. People with a more accurate understanding of the Earth knew that this journey would be far too long, not to mention his crimes against the indigenous peoples he encountered. Even by the standards of his day, he was an evil jerk. Story 28. The 4 food groups were beef, milk and cheese, bread and apples. Brought to you by the National Dairy Council. Story 29. Kurt Vonnegut said it well, but some of the nonsense was evil since it concealed great crime. For example, teachers of children in the United States of America wrote this date on blackboards again and again and asked the children to memorize it with pride and joy. 1492. The teachers told the children that this was when their continent was discovered by human beings. Actually, millions of human beings were already living full and imaginative lives on the continent in 1492. That was simply the year in which sea pirates began to cheat and rob and eliminate them. Story 30. Where to even start? Growing up in the southern U.S., I was subjected to an absolute sewer of bullshit about manifest destiny, white supremacy, the Civil War and its causes, civil rights struggles minimized and whitewashed, and on and on. I've spent my whole adult life unlearning the bullshit I was taught. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Lies my teacher told me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong by James W. Lowen. Answer, not unique to the South. I grew up in Southern California and the majority of American history was whitewashed up until the point I reached high school. Our American history teacher was a Native American, made this book required reading, and did not hold any punches the entire year. At the time I thought he was a real hard ass, but I am so fortunate to have taken his class. Story 31. That George Washington had wooden teeth. They were actually made with real teeth pulled from slaves. Story 32. That muscle can be turned into fat and vice versa. I heard this in schools in different states. What on earth? Story 33. That all serious academic writing must follow the conventions of a 5-paragraph essay. It was hard to get people to break out of this hardline thinking as a writing tutor. Story 34. When I learned that bats aren't blind, I stopped trusting every single thing I've learned in school. Story 35. The government's job was to take care and keep safe from harm the people who did and did not vote for them. A public servant serves the public. Story 36. The importance of higher education was beaten into us, and I disappointed my family by doing a trade program instead. I was told I would make far less money and have less opportunity. Turns out, the trades are still needed in recessions and during pandemics, and my job security is not subject to economy swings or seasonal changes, ample overtime, deferred comp, and a pension. I'm doing far better off than a sibling who sought higher education and is saddled with student debt and limited job prospects. Story 37. The amount of dairy you need. The Got Milk campaign was funded by the government to sell more milk and other dairy products. Story 38. That adults know everything. Not only do I not know everything, I feel like I don't know anything, and I don't feel like an adult. Story 39. The government has checks and balances to prevent a single person from accumulating too much power. Total bullshit. Story 40. Not disproven exactly, but I was taught to use double spaces after each sentence. I'm not even really that old. This was in like 2000, 2003 that I would have taken typing class in school. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that someone told me that the double spaces were a really old school way of typing. Answer. It's a holdover from typewriters. I learned to type from my mother who learned on a typewriter, and that's what she was taught. Monospaced fonts would create rivers of white space down the page due to how English, at least, is as a language. Most sentences tend to be a similar length, so sentences would end up lining up with monospaced fonts, like on a typewriter or an old school terminal, and would be distracting. Modern, past 40 years or so, variable width fonts don't have this issue. Reddit strips the second space out after a period, even if you type it in comments due to muscle memory. I'm 37 and I still have that habit, and I'm probably not going to break it since it's not hurting anything. Story 41. I remember being told that saber-toothed tigers went extinct because they couldn't eat. Their teeth were too big. Story 42. That the continents look like they all fit together is just a coincidence. They were never connected. Continents can never move. They formed in place exactly like they are now. Story 43. The definition of man is they are the tool user. I learned that in the mid-60s in elementary school, and Jane Goodall soon after that observed chimps altering a twig to use to catch termites to eat. I think by now several other animals have been observed using tools as well. And I learned that electrons orbit the nucleus like planets orbit a star. Story 44. In college, I learned about the learning styles. Some are auditory learners, some are visual learners, and some are hands-on learners. It's all pseudoscience bullshit. Story 45. That the U.S. GovT checks and balances system works, and people who commit crimes are held accountable in a court of law. Story 46. That I won't always have a calculator in my pocket, that bullying builds character, that going to college is the best and only choice for a decent future, that it's my responsibility not to distract or encourage men or boys, and that modesty would keep me safe, that women can do anything men can do, like be president. Story 47. That the Dutch Golden Age was something to be proud of and celebrated, that everyone was rich, tolerance was big in society, the stock market helped the people, and how backwards the authoritarian regimes in France, Germany, and Spain, all of them were. Way, way worse than the Netherlands. And how the Dutch didn't care about anything but trade, so they were good colonizers. The tolerance ended when there was a painting in the church and the skin color wasn't pale. The wealth ended where the clay became sand, and the goodness ended where the gargling G faded. The immense poverty, cruelty, intolerance, massacres, and especially greed is what defined this age. And worse if you were anywhere outside of the Meuse, Jussel, Zuiderzee, North Sea Island. Story 48. Not necessarily taught wrong on purpose, but electrons and valence shells are super simplified for high school to the point of barely being close to what you're taught later on. Story 49. Both my uncles were conscripted into the Portuguese colonial wars, 1961 to 1974, which culminated in the coup on 25 April 1974 in the Portuguese government. In 90s in the Texas high school I went to, the social studies teacher didn't believe this war existed, likely because their education was U.S. focused, and suggests that both my uncles were guerrillas mercenaries rather than members of the Portuguese military. The thing that annoys me to this day is not that she was wrong, but rather her conviction in her viewpoint. Story 50. That swimming within an hour of eating resulted in drowning. That quicksand caused huge numbers of deaths. 1970s. Story 51. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Got sent to the principal's office because I asked, if he discovered America, why did people greet him at the shore? Story 52. That my ancestors had no language, customs, culture, religion, etc. in Africa until they were rescued and brought here. Story 53. My English teacher took points off my essay because Obi-Wan Kenobi is correctly spelled as Obi-Wan Kenobi. I had read the novelization even before the movie came out and knew better. She could not be dissuaded. Story 54. We were taught in mid-1990s that the atmospheric CO2 level is 250 ppm. The truth is that 250 ppm was pre-industrial CO2 concentration, and by mid-1990s, the atmospheric concentration was more like 350 ppm, and by now it's IEK 425 pm. Story 55. We live in a big city, and I drew a picture of me, some deer I saw at a park in the city in second grade. I told my teacher we went there were deer everywhere. She called me a liar in front of the class, threw my drawing away. M4. Now there is indeed a metro park here that has a lot of deer. I take my kids there a lot. Still remember. Story 56. Went to a business school, was basically fed with the idea that the best career is Big Four, then corporate. Worked a corporate job for 2 years, then said F it, started my own business, now making 20x the pay. Story 57. Humans used to have an extra rib until God took one out and made a woman out of it. At the time, I thought, well, that was poor planning in every way. Now I'm just pissed that I was lied to, and I consider it a form of child harmful behavior. Story 58. College is where you go to earn your place in decent society. My freshman algebra teacher. I didn't get accepted into college. I guess I didn't earn the opportunity to prove myself worthy. Story 59. My freshman year of high school, I had a science teacher who did a whole week on denying the moon landing. We watched documentaries, and I think it was on the test. Blew my mind at first since I never heard about it, but the more I thought about it, she was just crazy. Story 60. That animals don't have emotions and only rely on instinct. Don't know why that was even a belief in the first place. Story 61. That you won't always have a calculator in your pocket. I'm literally typing this on a tiny supercomputer that lives in my pocket and argues with me about math if I want it to. Story 62. I still remember my school dean saying, only girls can have long hairs. You won't remain a b-boy if you have hairs longer 10 centimeters. Well, guess what? I still have my balls, and my hairs have been longer than 30 centimeters for more than a decade now. Story 63. If you work hard and apply yourself, one day you can afford a house and be able to retire at a decent age. Story 64. Summer is warm because the earth is closer to the sun. Winter is cold because the earth is further away. I guess not now disproven because it was known not to be true even when I was in school, but that's what my high school social studies teacher told us. I knew he was wrong. Looking back, I'm pretty sure he actually meant warm because the summer hemisphere is tilted toward the sun and cold because the winter hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. The lesson I learned is that social studies teachers should not teach scientific facts they only vaguely understand. Story 65. When I was in school, the only known planets lived in our own solar system, and we were taught accordingly. We now know that planetary bodies exist outside our own solar system and likely orbit most stars, 100 to 400 billion our Milky Way galaxy alone. These planets are the result of gas and dust and heavy elements gravitationally clumping together to form larger bodies, planets, moons, etc., and yielding the potential for life to develop just like it did on Earth. In other words, we are not alone in the galaxy or the universe, period. And that is so fracking cool. Story 66. That Shakespeare never collaborated. He wrote every word of every play attributed to him all by himself. Story 67. I went to school in a very religious area. As a kid in the 90s, I was taught the Bible passage that no human will ever live to the age of 120 again. This was because God got mad at us that one time or something. Lo and behold, in 1990, Jean Calment died at the age of 122. Story 68. The tongue map. What was taught? Your tongue has 4 distinct zones for taste. Sweet at the tip, salty and sour on the sides, and bitter at the very back. The reality, all areas of the tongue that have taste buds can detect all 5 basic tastes. Story 69. That Robert E. Lee was a good man loyal to Virginia. He disliked Virginia and almost led the Union Army, but flaked on them to lead the Confederate Army. Also was documented for being much crueler than other slave owners. But the South, including my AP US history teacher, glamorizes that man. It was only in the last 2-3 years that I learned the specifics of how shoot and cowardly he was. Story 70. Geography teacher told us the climate was cooling and we're heading towards the next ice age. I'm getting on a bit now. Story 71. That in the United States, we have 3 branches of government and a constitution that is supposed to provide checks and balances to protect against monarchy, authoritarianism, and tyrannical rule. Story 72. Evolution is wrong and creation is fact. Had to write a paper giving scientific evidence why evolution is wrong. Went to a Christian school. Story 73. Columbus discovered America because he wanted to prove the world was round, though I don't think that's so much disproven as the curriculum was straight up lying. Story 74. Jupiter does not have a super dense solid core of rock and metal. In the defense of our teachers, we didn't learn this until like 2015. Story 75. That the most dangerous eating disorder for us to be aware of was anorexia, and that you have to remember to eat plenty and that trying to be less fat is inherently dangerous. Prevalence of anorexia is 110K. Prevalence of obesity even then was about 110. Answer. What you posted isn't quite right either, as one is a mental illness and the other is a physical illness. It's a bit apples to oranges. Anorexia is found in 2 of women and it has the highest mortality rate of all known mental illnesses. Obesity is found in 40 of adults. Heart disease is the leading cause of passing, and 20 of deaths in a year is because of heart disease. Anorexia is a mental health disorder, and it is very dangerous to those people who have it. People with anorexia need professional support from mental health experts. Obesity isn't a mental health disorder, but it is very dangerous to those who are obese. Story 76. I was taught that the sun is a mass of incandescent gas, a gigantic nuclear furnace made hydrogen and helium at a temperature of millions of degrees. In fact, the sun is a miasma of incandescent plasma. The sun is not made of worm. The sun is a quagmire. It's not made of fire. Forget what you've been told in the past. Story 77. That you won't always have a calculator with you. I heard that from pretty much every math teacher I had. Now I have not only a calculator, but a powerful computer in my pocket all the time. Story 78. That nerves don't grow, rewire, or repair themselves. Therefore, if you injure yourself, you just lose that function permanently. No use trying. Story 79. Everyone believed the world was flat until Magellan circumnavigated the world. In actuality, it was generally believed the world was a sphere as early as Hellenistic Greece, or the 3rd century BC. Story 80. The domino effect that was used to promote the war in Vietnam. I believed it until I was facing the draft. Story 81. It's wrong to be left-handed. I got the ruler on the knuckles treatment in GR1 and GR2, 1955 to 1957. Forced to use my right hand during the crucial years for learning the motor skills for good printing and writing. My cursive has always been brutal as a result, so I print. Story 82. Gen X here. In 5th grade, my teacher taught us that racism basically stopped when Rosa Parks sat in the front seat. I shoot you not. Story 83. That the Electoral College is a useful part of the system designed to counteract populist ideologues. Story 84. The first time I took dendrology, the genus Acer was in the family Aceraceae, but it's now in Sapindaceae. Back then, the genus Celtis was in Omaceae, and now has been moved to Cannabaceae. I'm thankful for the genetic tools that are making taxonomy more accurate, but sometimes the changes are fast. Story 85. I was really disappointed to learn later in life that raindrops aren't actually teardrop-shaped. They are more kind of bun-shaped, if that makes sense. Story 86. You won't always have a calculator. General studies is important. People who stand up for themselves are worse than the people who attack them. Story 87. My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas became my very educated mother just served us noodles. Read more. Story 88. 1. That atoms were made of a proton, positive charge, a neutron, negative charge, and protons neutral. 2. That dinosaurs became extinct because we sneaky little mammals snuck around eating the dino eggs. 3. Mountains came about because the Earth was getting smaller, and the crust of the Earth got all wrinkly as the core shrank. 4. Most of my classmates and a fair number of teachers in my high school were creationists. My daughter-in-law graduated from the same high school 35 years after I did. Apparently, it had gotten better about most things, but still pretty bad. Story 89. Most of the dinosaur species I learned about were actually wrong in some fashion because paleontologists accidentally combined skeletons. Story 90. Went to fundamentalist Christian school for most of my life, save for 10th, 12th, and was taught that humans and dinosaurs walked the earth at the same time. If this was already disproven then, took to my early 20s in college to finally learn, accept the actual facts. Story 91. Learn math. It's not like you're going to have a calculator in your pocket your whole life. Well, listen here, meanie. Story 92. That the Confederacy fought for states' rights. To be fair, it's been disproven since the start of the Civil War. My one teacher was just really stubborn on the point. Story 93. In my civics class, Mr. Silverman, I really liked him, taught that there is 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial branches, each with its own specific powers and duties to ensure no single branch becomes too powerful. Well, 30 years later. Story 94. Left brain, logic versus right brain, creative thinking. Also, that generally boys were left-brained and girls were right-brained. And further, that as a girl who was good at math and science, I probably had a special bridged brain. Story 95. Was taught that you always use its, not its. That screwed me over for so long now. In college, I got nailed for using comma splices. Was like, what's a comma splice? I was taught to put a comma in whenever you wanted to pause. Learned not to do so just long enough to pass that class. Story 96. In Florida, they taught every student to run away from alligators in a zigzag pattern. Total bullshit. Story 97. The goddamn food pyramid of what a balanced daily diet includes. Turns out it was made by people in the food industry and not based on facts. Story 98. That the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. Just look at our coins. They've always said, in God we trust on them since the beginning. Story 99. Pluto, obviously. Also, when I was a kid, people weren't sure what eliminate off the dinosaurs. Asteroid impact was a fringe theory. Story 100. You can't use a calculator in your exams because you won't be carrying a calculator around in your pocket when you're older. Story 101. Getting through college and getting a steady job or trade would make everything turn out well and financially sound. Story 102. That giant pandas, like koalas, aren't bears. Koalas aren't, that is true. But it turns out giant pandas are. They aren't any more closely related to red pandas than polar bears are. They are actually ursine, just like all the other bears out there. Apparently they've done DNA testing and learned this. Broke my brain a lot. Story 103. That there were 9 planets in the solar system. My kid is being taught that there's only 8 and that Pluto isn't a planet. The food pyramid. We were taught to eat 7 servings of carbs a day or something silly. Story 104. That whole thing about taste buds being grouped off in sections of the tongue, the taste bud map, we even had to color in the chart and stuff when I was a wee one. Kinda goofy to believe in hindsight, but hey. Story 105. The food pyramid was still being taught when I was in high school and didn't get changed until after I graduated. Story 106. As a child, I was taught that electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom in paths, like planets orbiting a star. This is the Bohr model. That's definitely not how it works. Story 107. Plate tectonics. I remember in third grade commenting on how everything looked like it would fit together. I was told it's just a mysterious coincidence. This would have been the early 90s. Story 108. The police are your friends and will protect you. The truth, cops can lie. My good friend Billy, it sounds trite, but his name really is Billy, was 10 years old and starting to play pee-wee tackle football. On his way home, he saw a realtor sign and thought it MADE, a great tackling dummy. He took a few turns at it and set it back in place. A police officer witnessed this and ordered him into his patrol car. The officer took him home and told Billy's dad that he was caught pulling up multiple signs and throwing them into a busy street. Fortunately, his dad believed Billy and had to tell him the truth that cops will sometimes lie. This was 60 years ago. Every cop is different, just like people. I always cooperate if I am dealing with an officer, but I am leery as hell. Story 109. Coming from California, the treatment of natives by our state is grossly underrepresented. They maybe touch on it briefly with the Spanish conquest of the area, and maybe the California gold rush. Deep diving into it, it's much, much worse than the watered-down version. Only state to have a Native American genocide named after us. Go figure. Story 110. First they said eggs were good, then they said eggs were bad, then it was just the yolk, and just before I passed out, I thought, if it weren't for my horse, I wouldn't have spent that year in college. Story 111. You don't need to be worried reading passages of Huckleberry Finn out loud uncensored as long as it's in English class. Story 112. Even crazier still is I didn't know. Depending on where in the U.S. you went to school, you were taught different history. That's crazy. Story 113. That teachers are trusted adults. I'm 30 and work for the school system. Most teachers are wine drunks that definitely go on power trips and single out kids they don't like. Story 114. Pluto is a planet. It may have been downgraded on paper, but in my heart, it's still the scrappy 9th planet. Small, weird, and beloved. Rock on, Pluto. Rock on. Story 115. Columbus discovered America. At the first Thanksgiving, they ate turkey, like the natives, and forged a friendship with them. That learning history will keep us from repeating it. That checks and balances in government work. That slavery is abolished. That getting all A's means you will succeed in life. That learning how to cook, sew, and do childcare will guarantee you a good life. That hiding under a desk will keep you safe from bombs. That striking a child for whispering is okay. That geometry and algebra will be used in everyday life. That you know more than some of your teachers, but you can't tell them that. I could fill a whole page. Story 116. We were taught the tongue has taste zones. Not really. Most taste buds can detect all basics taste. The map was basically an oversimplified myth. Story 117. You won't have a calculator everywhere you go. While I don't often use the calculator function of my iPhone and Apple Watch, I do indeed always have at least one calculator with me, Mrs. Whitworth. Story 118. Heavy metal contains backwards messages that incite kids to take down. It wasn't even a religious school, but it was the 80s. Story 119. We were using a textbook created by Texas, which insisted that the Civil War was not about slavery. Story 120. I learned that panda bears are not bears, but akin to raccoons. 2 years ago, a friend who's an animal nut said panda bear, and hoping for once to catch him, I Wikipedia'd it only to find that they are now, or again, considered bears. Story 121. That blood is blue while inside your body. I was told this once in like third grade and it confused me for a long time. I was gaslit that it didn't happen until recently a video came out about this. This was early 2000s that I think it finally stopped. I was at the end of it. Story 122. That hiding under a desk would save us from a nuclear bomb. Oh wait, that was never true. Just a lie to keep us from doing whatever we wanted to do because we were all doomed to die anyway. Story 123. When students looked at a world map and said it looked like the continents around the Atlantic Ocean had once been a single landmass that had broken apart and landmasses had moved away from each other, teachers told us we were wrong, that it was just coincidence that it looked like that. Story 124. That humans only use 10 of their brains. I remember thinking, wow, imagine if I could unlock the rest. Turns out the whole thing's already in use. I was just tired. Story 125. I'm a boomer, so we were fed a lot of misinformation. 2 off the top of my head. 1, blood is blue until it hits the air. 2, everyone thought the earth was flat, but Columbus thought it was round. Story 126. Some of our blood is blue because it is unoxygenated. This is a blatant lie and no parts of our blood are blue. Story 127. That the President of the United States is an honorable person and will do what is best for the people, all the people. Now we know he is a felon, a pedophile, a liar, stanky, a grifter, a tax evader, intimacy offender who does what is best for himself and his rich white male counterparts. Story 128. Pluto is a planet. Columbus discovered America. 3 branches of government are separate but equal. America is a land of immigrants. Story 129. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Turned out he stole the prototype from an Italian-American inventor who tried to patent it through Bell at the patent office. Bell had 0 parents his entire life, which should have been the biggest indicator. Story 130. Honesty is the best policy. Life is not that simplistic. Sometimes lying or lying by omission is the better choice. Story 131. That private companies are more efficient than governments. Efficiency just turned out to be a euphemism for fudge everyone else over in order to ensure that as much profit can be extracted from something as possible. Story 132. Anything about Christopher Columbus. He didn't discover shoot, he wasn't an explorer, and was genuinely a disgusting human being all around. Story 133. The Earth is only 6,000 years old. Too many others to name. Just let's stop allowing religious indoctrination as coursework. Story 134. Brontosaurus existed. Pluto was a planet. Adults knew what they were doing. The USA was something to be proud of. Story 135. That the fastest swimmer gets in the egg chooses, sends a signal to let it in, then solidifies and chops the heads off. Story 136. That the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. My teacher at the time, Mr. Johnson, knew this was controversial and bragged about how he wrote some paper on it in college. It's just such an obviously wrong take. Even with that framing, it takes 2 seconds to realize that the most important state right that they wanted to protect and was the right to have legal slavery. The audacity for a white man to teach this nonsense to black children is infuriating. This was only about 10 years ago. Story 137. Don't rely on a calculator. You won't always have one. Not necessarily a fact, but given like a statement by my math teacher. Story 138. The invisible hand of the market would help balance things out and allow the greedy, who weren't doing things that were beneficial to society, to be replaced with others. Story 139. That the Civil War was not about slavery, but about states' rights. Yes, states' rights. To keep slavery. Looking at it now, there's no way to polish that turd. But boy, did they try in the 80s in the South. Story 140. That there are only 2 sexes. Intersex people exist with various hormonal, anatomical, and chromosomal differences than the typical X-sex female and XY male. Story 141. A few of my friends who grew up in the Deep South were taught the War of Northern Aggression as recently as the 80s, 90s. The heroic South was standing up for the states' rights guaranteed in the Constitution, and the North was a tyrannical aggressor. Story 142. That the phrase government of the people, by the people, for the people encapsulates democracy. This fact has been proven to be untrue over the last 9 months. Story 143. The Cold War ended. The Cold War never ended. It morphed into something different, but with similar strategic goals, whose ideology will dominate the working class masses, allowing for the accumulation of wealth, resources, and power. The message changed, but results remain the same. Those with subjugating those without behind a grab bag, veneer of nationalism, religion, ethnic superiority, etc. Couple this with our aging nuclear deterrence infrastructure, and we're about as close to midnight on the nuclear Armageddon clock as we've ever been IMO. Story 144. My tech teacher in high school once said that satellite internet will never be as fast as broadband. The very next day, HughesNet launched a new service making satellite internet as fast as broadband. He ate his words less than 24 hours after making that statement. Story 145. It had already been disproven, but I was young and didn't know better, but that the United States was founded on anything other than slavery and genocide. Story 146. That if you get a college degree, you'll make more money than everyone who doesn't, and over your lifetime, you'll be much better off. Story 147. My ninth grade history teacher tried to tell our class that the 18th century were the years of 1750 to 1850, the 19th century was 1850 to 1950, and so on. I corrected her and was scolded and sent to the principal's office. Story 148. If you study and learn well, you will have a bright future. Sure, if the study materials have anything to do with real life and you inherit a bunch of stuff, I still laugh at this one. Story 149. Columbus was the first European to find the Americas. The Vikings got there 400 years before he did. Story 150. That indigenous people were savages, and we had to conquer them to survive and make this land livable. That was a lie. Story 151. Magellan was the first to circumnavigate the globe. He made it to the Philippines before he died. His ship did. Story 152. Dinosaurs aren't real. Fossils were put on Earth by Satan to trick people into not thinking the world is 6,000 years old. I went to an evangelical K-8. Yeah, I got out. Story 153. In about 2008, we were told that by the time we were old enough to drive, we wouldn't have any more gas left. It was in a textbook telling us about renewable energy as well. Looking back, I'm sure the textbook said something about the current known oil supply, or something like that, but that was not how it was presented to our class. Story 154. That teachers reading their notes to the students and the students copying down the notes word for word was the best way to learn. And it's definitely what professors and students do in college. Certainly not the best way to learn, and absolutely not what they do college. It is what extremely lazy 10th grade high school history teachers did back in the 80s. At least that's what my 10th grade high school history teacher did. What a great way to bore kids and make them dislike history and school in general. Story 155. It hasn't exactly been disproven because Irish people always knew it, but more English people are now aware that the Irish famine in the 1800s wasn't simply about bad potatoes. Story 156. Something about a brontosaurus not existing or existing, still confused on that one, doesn't really matter. Story 157. I distinctly recall a college chemistry class instructor claiming that very old cathedrals in Europe had windows which were thicker on the bottom because glass is a very slow-moving liquid. More obliquely, in the late 60s and early 70s, the Sunday funny papers in the newspaper would be in color, and at that time Wrigley's Gum had a series of fun facts, usually 4 or 5 facts, clearly derived from Ripley's Believe It or Not, printed horizontally at the bottom of the page. One of these supposed facts was that man is the only animal that sleeps on its back. For some reason, that claim stuck with me for many years. With time, I learned the useful words prone and supine. But with the fullness of time, I learned both dogs and cats often sleep supine. I believe there are other animals that do as well. Come on, Wrigley's. Story 158. The Laffer curve. In fact, it had been disproven before I was in school. In fact, had been disproven before I was born. Story 159. First Americans came on land bridge 10,000 years ago. Now we know there were much older population migration and peoples in the Americas. Story 160. We don't have 5 senses. Depending on how you categorize, we have up to 30. The notion of 5 senses is both arbitrary and culturally specific. If someone took away your hearing, sight, touch, taste, and smell, you would still know when you were standing at a slight angle, vestibular sense, and you would still be able to put your index finger on your left nostril without feeling around first, proprioception, and so on. Story 161. In college, a professor who focused on slaveholders in the South was quite sure Thomas Jefferson would not have violation and impregnated Sally Hemings. Then DNA testing happened. Story 162. That glass is a liquid, or a supercooled liquid, that flows very slowly, which is why old church windows are thicker at the bottom. Story 163. I was taught that blood was blue until it hit oxygen, hence why our veins look blue through our skin. Total bullshit. Story 164. In Fudge State Uni, in like 2015, I had a biology teacher who said scientists still aren't sure about the concept of evolution. She didn't try to say we were created by God or anything, but she very much made it clear she was skeptical of evolution. I am sure she'll have a fantastic teaching career once she inevitably moves to Oklahoma. As a pro musician, I don't want to slag off, okay? They've been one of the coolest states to play in, and the people are fantastic. Their state government just sucks dogs for quarters. Story 165. Back in the day, we all were told that everything we get converted to the metric system. In the United States, it never really took hold unless you were a scientist or mathematician, I suppose. Now, we've got a bunch of things that are made that use standard measurements, and a bunch of things are made that use metric measurements. Can't we all just get along? Story 166. It was like the next year in high school. That meanie in grade 8 actually told us a lot as one word. What the fudge? Story 167. Dinosaurs. They looked completely different in all the textbooks in school, so much so that it's hard for me to comprehend and picture how they really looked. Story 168. Not quite proven wrong as such, but in primary school, a teacher told us that we eat chocolate eggs on Easter because the stone that blocked the entrance to Jesus' tomb was egg-shaped. When I told my parents, they cracked up. She must have just made that up on the spot. Story 169. Lincoln was the great emancipator. Lincoln was actually a moderate Republican who consistently stated he simply wanted to stop slavery's expansion. He was fine with it existing in states where it was already legal. Even during TNE Civil War, it was Union generals that first began to emancipate slaves that sought safety in Union camps like Fort Monroe. Lincoln only addressed emancipation as a war goal to deprive the South of its economic livelihoods. He was still great president, but I would say Grant was the true first civil rights president we had. Story 170. I remember arguing with my health teacher that washing hands with hot or warm water was no more effective than cold water. It was the soap that was needed for cleaning, not the water temp. I still meet adults who believe this, but this is generally accepted as true now. Story 171. I grew up in Texas in the 70s when the Daughters of the Confederacy were influencing curriculum. It's probably easier to ask what was real out of all the bullshit. Story 172. That humans lived alongside dinosaurs, and the Earth is 6,000 years old, and the government monitors how much cash we try to take out of our country via metal detectors that track the little metal strips in paper bills. Unsurprisingly, I'm not a big fan of religious schools these days. Story 173. Penny drop from a tall building would be going fast enough to pass right through you. Terminal velocity did not exist when I was in grade 6. Story 174. When I was in first grade, my science teacher told me the trees moving make wind. I'm still unsure if he was joking with me, but I believed it for a long time. Story 175. That the universe would eventually collapse on itself, with gravity eventually reversing the expansion. We knew almost nothing about dark energy then, and we know slightly more than nothing now. Story 176. Not sure it's a fact as such, but my understanding of war, what life would have been like during war, etc., have evolved massively from the simple understanding I got from school. Story 177. I was in a play in elementary school about Christopher Columbus wanting to prove that the world was round. Oddly, the play didn't make mention of RPG, enslaving, or take down people in the New World. Story 178. I have something that's not disproven, but when I was in school, we didn't have evidence that planets outside of our solar system existed. That's so hard to think about knowing how many we have discovered. Story 179. Wahrscheinlich Scheitern. 1. Pluto has since been downgraded to a dwarf planet. At least the word planet still appears in its category. 2. An attempt. Neanderthals is a direct ancestor of Homo sapiens. It is now known that Neanderthals had a separate evolutionary lineage. At our school, the teachers had to adapt their lessons in real time. I had discovered and read a book about Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis, in the library and then discussed the latest scientific findings with the teachers when the topic was covered in school. The history and biology teachers involved informed themselves and actually updated their lessons at our school, even though they differed from the old theories in the textbooks and on the posters by several years. Story 180. You can only stand an egg up on its end on the equinox. Truth is that you can do it every day. It's just really hard to do. Story 181. Indians wore deerskin, lived in teepees, used bows and arrows, feather headrests, always honest, noble, no metal, useless, technology, totem pole, etc. Of course, there were hundreds upon hundreds of groups over 2 continents who did their own thing over thousands of years. 1491 by Charles Mann, and years of watching Nova really opened my eyes to the amazing things indigenous people did before being decimated by disease and cultural actual genocide. Story 182. The tongue has different zones for sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. Turns out that colorful taste map chart was basically a lie we all memorized for a test. Every part of your tongue with taste buds can detect all those tastes. The differences are tiny and not zones at all. I spent years carefully placing food on my tongue for no reason. Story 183. You will never use calculator for math. Got to have instant answers on crunch time. Yet I am using Desmos for math in college. My professors allow and encourage. Story 184. We were taught to learn to type with a keyboard. BC. Pecking isn't efficient and won't serve as well in the real world. Every single one of us now peck on our smartphone keyboard regardless of our typing abilities. LOL, it's amusing to me. Story 185. Blood is blue before it touches air. I've been on Reddit a while now. I still remember my first week someone screamed at me in comments because I didn't know this yet. Like, chill, I'm old. It takes time for me to learn about these newfangled ideas. Story 186. X is female and XY is male. The default for embryonic development is ovarian development. This shifts to testicular development in the presence of a gene called SRY. SRY is commonly found on the Y chromosome, but during formation of gametes can cross over to the X chromosome. I've run clinical genetic testing and encountered men who were born phenotypically male who are XX and vice versa. Their samples are always redrawn and retested to make sure, and it's always confirmed repeatedly. Usually if it's a sequencing test, we'll have data for the presence or absence of SRY, which is a further confirmation. That being said, this isn't the only mechanism by which intimacy chromosomes don't line up with phenotypic intimacy. The pathways to get to development of a human being are complex, and there are dozens of proteins which simply won't function as expected with a single nucleotide variant. A person can be resistant to signaling molecules like hormones. A person cannot produce said signaling molecules properly. Biology is messy and complex, and the people who reduce it down to ironclad simplicity and yes, no thinking usually haven't progressed beyond a high school understanding. Story 187. That everyone during the 1400s believed the earth was flat, and that was why they didn't support Columbus' expedition. It was proven to be round by the ancient Greeks along with the size. Columbus got incredibly lucky that the Americas were there because he didn't plan for or have the provisions to complete the journey otherwise. Also that he discovered it. The Vikings would probably disagree. Story 188. I had a professor in college, the socialist breeding ground, who made fun of me for claiming the CIA overthrew Salvador Allende. Yep, they did. Story 189. All through school, we were taught there were 3 stages of matter. And then all of a sudden, like 10th grade, a 4th pops up. Story 190. That Wikipedia isn't a trusted site for getting information. Wikipedia articles are vetted better than the people that run this country. Story 191. I had a 4th grade science teacher tell us our blood is actually blue because once we get a cut or bleed, it turns red from reacting with oxygen. It looks blue because our skin is translucent and something veins and vessels make it look blue under our skin. Story 192. Apparently, Pluto is no longer a planet. It will always remain a planet to me. The mnemonic doesn't work otherwise. Story 193. We had a long section in social sciences about UN interventions, and it was 100 positive. Like, just entirely, this is what happens, and this is what is intended, and it works. I mean, that was disproven by reality even back then, but it was quite shocking in hindsight. Another one requires context. I'm German, and we generally do sections on West II and the Holocaust a lot in school here. There's still a lot of textbooks that treat the post-war denazification like it was sweeping and thorough instead of a very short-lived operation, abandoned and often reversed very quickly afterwards. Eat it. Thought of another one. We learned that the SPD was the only party to not vote for the empowerment of Hitler, which is correct, but only because the KPD had already been put into concentration camps. In general, the SPD got a way softer portrayal in school than is reasonable, being depicted as the reasonable, peaceful wing of resistance. Story 194. I was taught that Mercury was the hottest planet. A student corrected them on a national level, and they changed how it was taught. Answer. In the 90s, a teacher made fun of me in front of the class for answering a question on a test that Venus was actually hotter than Mercury. Our textbook also said Mercury was the hottest planet. My mom actually went and had a private discussion with the teacher, after which she apologized. She also got books, etc., which proved that Venus was the hottest planet. Story 195. They told us that smoking 1 green stuff cigarette was equivalent to smoking 20 cigarettes and was 10x more carcinogenic. Story 196. I was taught some version of genetics being immutable, so the emergence of epigenetics as a field has upended a lot of my understanding of how genetics and environment interact. Story 197. Blood is blue in your veins, but turns red when it hits oxygen. IDK, if it was really a fact then, or been disproven, but I've learned it's not true. 8th grade health class teacher taught us that. Story 198. Growing up, I was literally led to believe, and definitely not the only black person, that Eli Whitney, inventor of the cotton gin, was black. Story 199. Carrots help vision. Sitting too close to the TV harms vision. Can't swim within 30 minutes after eating. Answer: the can't swim within 30 minutes of eating is kind of true. If you are going to be extremely physically active in a pool, you definitely don't want to swim immediately after eating. It's like going running right after you eat. Most people will get sick and throw up. I've had kids throw up in my pool doing the same shoot. My parents made it a rule because cleaning a pool is a pain in the jerk. Story 200. Basically every atomic model. In India, they teach us a new model every year, starting 6th grade, starting with Rutherford's. I understand the necessity of it, but learning each year that they taught us the wrong science last year after year, is a bit frustrating. Answer: I have never been good at science, but I have a friend who was a biology major in college. He would tell me there is a notoriously difficult class called organic chemistry, which he said was difficult because it upends a lot of the things students are taught previously. Apparently, a lot of science teaching involves teaching people stuff that appears right, but is actually a serious simplification. And it all comes falling down in organic chemistry, which is why so many students struggle in that course. I definitely understand the idea. I teach kindergarten now, and I have to teach a lot of oversimplifications and misleading content because being truthful would overwhelm students and not be useful. Story 201. Never mind in school. I'm still getting over the lie my father told me about the interior light being on while driving. Story 202. The hole in the ozone layer will never go away. The best case scenario was that it would stay the same size. Story 203. You need to be able to write in cursive. I now enjoy being able to write and have people not be able to read it, not just because of my horrible handwriting. Answer: weirdly enough, my second child was taught cursive again in school when my first, a few years earlier, was not. 2010s. This was in the very early learning to write stages, and I thought the theory behind it, which I asked about and then looked into, was quite interesting, and in the case of my children seemed to hold some water. The idea being that learning cursive letters teaches your muscle memory that letter forms, and ultimately words, have a certain direction, in this case LR, in a way that learning block letters just does not. So a lowercase h, for example, is a swoop up very high, then a movement back down the same-ish path, followed by a bump that goes up halfway, then down again. This is a far more natural way of learning the letter than copying a block letter H, which is a long, tall line and a curved hump line, but in no particular order. My first child would often make an H by doing the hump line first, and then putting the tall line to the left of it, often going up from the bottom. There was no real way of getting through to him that he should do the line first and going down, because he, quite rightly, didn't really understand what difference it makes. The result is a block H. So what does it matter? Thing is, he still does that now as an adult. And when I watch him write, it's slow and awkward and doesn't really look like he's writing, he's drawing individual letters. And when he tries to do that at any speed, it becomes illegible. There are other reasons for this, but I do believe that learning cursive in school would have helped him. We read and write from left to right, and I think cursive teaches you that automation in a way that block letters does not. Sorry, long post. Ita. My youngest was only taught cursive in those early writing stages. Never had to keep it up, do anything fancy, or learn cursive capital letters, which are often ridiculous. I had to write entire papers in cursive in the 80s, and I dislike it. I don't think it's useful for anything other than that automation. Story 204. I was taught that you put your hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. My teen daughter learned this summer to put her hands at 9 and 3 in driver's ed. Apparently it's safer if when airbags are deployed. Answer: it's not just safer for airbags, it's just generally more efficient. It causes less fatigue over a long time. It gives you better leverage around the wheel. It encourages proper posture and seating distance. 10 and 2 is just super outdated, a relic of an older era where we didn't have mandatory airbags, and a crumple zone was where you threw your crumpled up trash next to the ashtray. 9 and 3 is strictly better in every way. Story 205. When I was in school, I was told that Marilyn Manson got his own rib removed for reasons that are hazy to me. It turns out that isn't true, though. Story 206. That the colonizers were believed to be gods by the indigenous populations and empires of the Americas. It couldn't be further from the truth. They were actually seen as strange, and everyone wondered why they smelled so bad that they had to light incense in their presence. Story 207. The Civil War was about states' rights and not slavery. The southern states literally stated their reasoning for breaking away from the Union was mainly due to slavery. Story Story 208. Some variation of, you need to know X because you won't always have Y to help you. Y could be calculator, computer, the internet, a dictionary, map, etc., etc. Answer, at risk of Reddit's wrath, why is this such a disliked notion? The idea behind it is sound. You internalize material better when you can perform the task yourself instead of looking them up. Teachers never said this as prognosticators of future technology. They said it as teachers. The prediction is irrelevant. A world where nobody can perform basic math or spell correctly without looking it up first is a world filled with the dumbest, most useless fudge people you've ever seen. If you lack a learning ability preventing it, your memory is still the best tool you have for learning and for life. People who had to do all the math in their heads sent people to the fudge moon. The second a society loses that ability, that society has failed. Story 209. Indigo was in the color spectrum, Roy G. Boehm. Now it's just Roy GB because the wavelengths aren't distinguishable enough for most people. Story 210. Boys grow up to be doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. Girls grow up to be mothers and nurses. I was literally taught this in the second grade. Emold. Story 211. The structure of an atom, with electrons orbiting a nucleus in neat little circles. Since Heisenberg, not the Breaking Bad character, the physicist he was named after, developed the uncertainty principle in the 1920s, we've known that electrons don't really work that way at all. But it's kind of hard to visualize how it all really works. We prefer thinking of particles like they're physical lumps of stuff we can see and interact with, just like the objects in our everyday lives. Not as probabilistic energy clouds that only start existing somewhere once we try to measure it. If you aren't doing a degree in quantum mechanics, though, it's not something you'll ever come across, and learning the Bohr models is a good enough approximation. A lot of stuff in degree-level physics turns out to be very different from what you learned in high school. Story 212. Sometimes they're not disproven, but rather, what we were taught was a deliberate simplification. The way air flowing over an airfoil wing produces lift is simplified to be the Bernoulli principle, because in 6th grade science or high school physics, that's enough to get by on. But if you want to get serious about aerodynamics at the college engineering level, you get into concepts like circulation and spanwise flows and realize, hey, this doesn't sound like Bernoulli at all. Those bastards lied to me. There are a zillion topics like this where you can't fire hose lay people with all the concepts required to build and deliver a Mars rover. Rather, you offer a few simplified building blocks that are enough for most people and replace later in those who want to dig in deeper. The problem is that a lot of people become emotionally invested in the simplifications and then come to see the more sophisticated later knowledge as an affront to their beliefs and thus a conspiracy. We live in a time when people binge watch 5 episodes of The Good Doctor and are thus qualified to render deep opinions about how health policy should work at the national level. Same happens with how laws work, and the military works, and courts work. Literally everything that doesn't conform to many people's TV drama-based intuition is a lie, and thus so-called experts are actually conspirators. It's exhausting. Story 213. The Earth is 6,000 years old, disproven long before it was taught to me. I'm a little behind the time. Story 214. In American schools, the textbooks taught us a very one-sided version of major events in history. What really sticks out is how the books describe the way the United States was established in North America as a peaceful, friendly, and positive thing, when in reality it was a partial genocide on the Native American Indians. Answer, Andrew Jackson actually did commit genocide. The Indian Removal Act was intended to eliminate most Native Americans. When people talk about the Nazis being the best at genocide, I always think America was actually the best. We managed to eliminate almost an entire continent of people by displacing them, and through disease, among other things. I'm not minimizing the Holocaust because it was truly horrible, but Native Americans were treated like crap and still are. The few reservations I've been on are bad, and you can feel despair in the air on some of them. Story 215. Poor Pluto. It got done dirty. You'll always be a whole official planet in my heart. You the best Sailor Moon girl. Don't you worry. Story 216. That Columbus was a special little boy who thought the world was round when everyone else thought the world was flat. Story 217. I'm white, and my history teacher was white. I remember telling him that I thought people flying the Confederate flag was racist, and he argued with me, and the class laughed when he dunked on me. That was like 20 years ago. Story 218. Thanksgiving is a celebration of when the Pilgrims and Indians sat down to have a happy, loving meal together. Story 219. Said to many little girls, if a boy is mean to you, it's because he secretly likes you. No, it means he's a little prick in training. Move on. Story 220. I was always told that coffee would stunt my growth. It's not true. It's an old wives' tale with no scientific backing. Story 221. Slavery in the U.S. was ended by the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was still legal in a few states and some counties or parishes in Louisiana until the 13th Amendment. Story 222. Eerie taught me that I'd be offered free substances all the time. I learned that Native Americans moved to Oklahoma to make room for white colonists. I learned that greed is actually good and that sharing things is actually bad, though nobody could tell me why. Something latent McCarthyism, I guess. I learned that homosexuality is a mental illness. Not necessarily debunked, just the science has changed. The classification of many living organisms has changed dramatically in the last 30 years, some even in entirely different kingdoms. Story 223. That I won't have a calculator on me at all times in the real world. I could be whatever I wanted when I grew up. Pretty much everything about nutrition, seafood pyramid. Story 224. There are 7 colors in the rainbow, thanks to Isaac Newton, who believes 7 is a magical number. He was slightly colorblind and asked a friend to divide the rainbow into 7 for him. Redditors in Florida, be warned that discussing rainbows may get you in trouble. Story 225. MLK Jr. rallied the people. Racism was eradicated. Black people were instantly made equal in the eyes of the law and the locals, and everybody lived happily ever after without having to work for it any longer. Christopher Columbus. Capitalism is bestism. America was founded as a country for people fleeing government overreach and religious persecution to be a place of freedom for all to practice whatever religion they want, and that there will be a clear separation of church and state. Wait, isn't this stuff still being taught today? Story 226. The Civil War was over states' rights, although that was probably widely disproven at the time I learned it too, but the AP curriculum and my conservative history teacher didn't give a shoot. Story 227. That the Civil War was about states' rights and not about slavery went to middle school in Mississippi. Story 228. Maybe my school was different, but none of these things were actually taught in school. They were just shoot you heard from other kids. Story 229. Degrees grant you jobs. To be fair, important jobs in society can still require degrees. Depends on what role you're going for. Story 230. Passing penalty was cheaper and more effective at reducing crime. Wasn't even true then. IDK what that teacher was smoking. Story 231. I was taught in primary that Christopher Columbus was the one who discovered that the earth is round. Story 232. I was, still am, a huge dinosaur nerd, but the Alvarez theory about the asteroid only was published when I was in about 4th grade. So back when I was a kid, no one knew why dinosaurs went extinct. Now we do. Story 233. If you touch a baby bird, the mom will smell the human on it and eliminate it. Birds don't have a keen enough sense of smell to smell humans. Birds don't eliminate their babies. Humans eliminate the babies by giving them diseases their bodies can't fight. This myth was likely created by bird experts because a human child cannot fathom just how fragile a baby bird is. Don't try handling baby birds, but don't think you're starting them on a ticking clock of passing if you have to. Story 234. I remember being in elementary school and being absolutely fascinated with space. I grabbed a book from the library and was reading on the solar system. And when the teacher came by and asked what I was reading, I told her that page was about the elliptical orbit of Pluto and how it changes form furthest to second furthest planet. She took the book and returned it and told me that what I read was absolutely not true. She pushed for a bunch of the astronomy books to be removed, and I felt like I did something wrong for just wanting to read and learn. Story 235. Sadly, we were taught that black people had thicker skulls and heavier bones than white people, and their skin was thicker than ours. I was in elementary school in New York on the island. I am pretty sure it was a guest speaker, as our teacher was a female, and it was a man teaching the class. I was so shocked, and it just seemed so weird that this man was saying such a thing. It just seemed all kind of wrong. We were also taught that the girls would grow up to be homemakers. If we worked, we could be secretaries or teachers. We had home EC classes where we learned how to make Jell-O fruit molds, nasty stuff, and cakes. That's it for this video. Don't forget to support Vancher and my second channel, Vanchoose. See you soon.